Could you imagine being denied the right to see some of your favorite bands and artists just because they're from a foreign country? What if popular artists and groups like Adele, Justin Bieber, Shakira, and Coldplay were all denied access to America because they were considered to be robbing Americans of their jobs? This was almost a reality for Americans in the early 1960s when the Beatles were almost banned and a revolution to salvage pop culture began. In the early 1960s, the United States and the United Kingdom had a man-for-man agreement when it came to foreign entertainers. The United States would get one English artist or band in exchange for giving England one American artist or band. And to maintain this balance, America relied on the Immigration and Naturalization Service as well as the U.S. Department of Labor to enforce this policy. This pact between both countries went well until Beatlemania swamped the U.S., and the Beatles disrupted the desired balance. Claims were made against the Beatles for breaking the pact. The Beatles, who were in America several times before and after their agreement, failed to ever submit contracts to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, meaning they were in America without approval during late 1963 and early 1964. In February of 1964, the Beatles were in the country without approval, and this did not go unnoticed. On the 9th of the month, the Beatles performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, where they broke American television records, peaking at 70 million views. The Beatles showed that among Americans they were very popular, and that they were clearly going to profit from it.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you. Tomorrow I'll miss you. Remember, I'll always miss you.
The American Federation of Musicians and the American Guild of Musical Artists just couldn't take any more of the Beatlemania in the U.S., so they took the complaints to the government, protesting that foreign entertainers were taking jobs from American entertainers. Herman Kinnon, the president of the American Federation of Musicians, took the matter into his own hands and wrote a letter to English unions addressing the fact that the Beatles were in America against the wishes of the U.S. unions and without approval, not following the pact of exchange. After contacting the English, Herman turned his protest to the American government, specifically to Willard Wirtz, the Department of Labor Secretary. The unions protested against foreign entertainers being excluded from certain provisions in the Immigration and Nationality Act. Due to complaints and negotiation among the Department of Labor, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the State Department, and unions was made, and a new reform that included entertainers was created. Under this new reform, foreign entertainers must apply to enter the U.S. through the Immigration and Nationalization Service, or INS. INS would decide if the entertainer fell into one of two categories. The first category included entertainers of distinguished merit and ability. INS would instantly permit these entertainers entrance into the U.S. The second group included entertainers without unique talents. INS would transfer this group of entertainers to the Department of Labor, where ordered clearance would be further deliberated. On March 25, 1964, Secretary Wirtz said, "While this is a difficult responsibility to assume, we are nevertheless undertaking it effective April 15th, in order to protect American workers." And in a press release on April 3, 1964, the Department of Labor officially announced the new procedure. With the announcement of the new protocol, articles by journalist Victor Riesel such as "U.S. Unions Bottle Up Beatles" and "Inside Labor" appeared in newspapers all across the country. These articles addressed the very much vindictive motives of Herman Kinnon, where he was quoted saying, "Rallying up some sturdy forces in the U.S. Department of State, Labor, and Justice to stand off another Beatle invasion," creating implications that there was little to no chance that the Beatles would be issued clearance back into the U.S. Victor Riesel, a journalist, even went on to say in one of his articles, "This government power affecting hundreds of millions of dollars worth of business has literally been taken over by a brace of unions." Riesel's words sparked an instant reaction in the fans across America, action that essentially helped begin a revolution in the U.S. While all of this was occurring, the Beatles were climbing up the Billboard charts. They held the top 5 slots for their singles "Can't Buy Me Love," "Twist and Shout," "She Loves You," "I Wanna Hold Your Hand," and "Please Please Me."
The Beatles entered our culture. They became sociologically and culturally significant. They went past their music. Now when that happens, you have something amazing. Because here they are today, their music is extremely important. We'll always remember their cultural contributions, right? So the Beatles, once again, very important during its time for our culture and of course for the Beatles and for the British. They set the entire stage for what we call the so-called British invasion.
The Beatles' success showed that music in America was changing, and what was known as the British invasion was just beginning. This massive conquest of British music groups and artists impacted the popularity of music for the remainder of the decade. This musical revolution changed the country's love of surf music, girl groups, and Elvis into a new infatuation for British rock and roll music. Groups like the Beatles and Dave Clark 5 were stealing the hearts of fans all over the country, and nothing was going to stop these fans from getting the music they loved. Fans of the Beatles revolted against this new policy by sending hundreds of letters and petitions to government officials such as President Lyndon B. Johnson, Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy. In these letters, American adults and teenagers requested, pleaded, and demanded that the Beatles be ordered clearance back into the U.S. Danielle Blackwell of Arkansas claimed that she and 3 other girls were so upset that they couldn't even go to school, and said, "This is no laughing matter for me or any other fan of the Beatles." Sandy Cooper of Ohio asked the government, "Why should we keep good talent out of the United States just because the performers are not American?" Terry Klum, a father from California, wrote, "It seems to me that the Beatles should be allowed to come back to the United States, as I don't believe that they will replace any other musician. They are quite unique in nature," adding that his daughters are huge fans. One of the most powerful letters came from Bonnie Wilkins, who said, "In the past few weeks, Miss Debbie Page and I have been sponsoring a campaign against a decision made by you. This concerns actions you are taking to keep British groups, especially the Beatles, out of the United States. We have petitions from numerous parts of the country, all stating our extreme dislike and disapproval of your efforts. These aren't just crank petitions, for we have studied the problem carefully, and we realize that we are only minors, and that you hold a high and esteemed position as leaders of our country. But in this case, we can't accept the statement, 'You can't fight City Hall.' We are going to fight, argue, negotiate, and keep on sending you thousands of names until some action is taken. Please don't just laugh at our petitions and throw them in the wastebasket. Please hear our plea. I'm sure you've had your fads when you were teenagers, and just because they're from another country, there's no need to act that way towards the Beatles. We were a little tired of our American singers, and the Beatles are a refreshing change." Despite all the teenagers' belief that the government would not listen, the government did reply to all the letters. In a response letter to Bonnie Wilkins, Secretary Wirtz said, "The reports that I'm trying to keep out the Beatles are absolutely incorrect." His letter went on to say that all of this uproar was caused by an erroneous news report, and that the Beatles could easily reapply to gain clearance back into the States. He even concluded on a personal note by saying, "While the government of the United States is old, it is not run by old fogies." Wirtz's letters tried to reassure people that the Beatles would in fact come back to the U.S., just like they did in February of that year. Wirtz was informed that when the Beatles entered America in February, they entered under the Immigration and Naturalization Service category for performers with no unique talents. But after their amazing performance on The Ed Sullivan Show and the reception of nearly half the U.S. population, things had changed. At this point, the Beatles had a positive praise from The Ed Sullivan Show and the performance at the Coliseum in Washington, D.C. under their belt. Essentially, the Beatles were now more likely to be considered entertainers of distinguished merit and ability, which meant they can gain clearance back into the U.S. As many people know today, this was certainly the case, and the Beatles gained access to America without having to come before the Department of Labor. Thanks to the people of the U.S. who banded together and fought to reform the government and unions' actions, the Beatles remained in the States, and new British musicians followed. Without this revolt, the British invasion era may have never occurred, and Americans could have never known the music that essentially pushed them through all the hardships of the 1960s. Artists like the Kinks, Billy Joe Kramer, the Rolling Stones, the Moody Blues, the Who, and Dusty Springfield could have never made it into the U.S., and music as we know it would not be the same.